be skeptical. We kind of had a little bit of an introduction there. So the question is, why should we be skeptical? And so let's kind of talk about that for just a little bit. First off, just because it's published doesn't mean that it's a good study. So it's really important that you should be able to try to figure out the story that you're reading, the article that you're reading, is it quality? And we'll come into why that's not necessarily the case with all these studies that we're seeing now. There can be a lot of reasons that it's not a good study, and you need to be able to pick some of those out. And so this is a skill, and just like any skill, it takes practice to be able to do this. The abstract conclusions may not be correct. I actually just had an interaction with a paramedic about a particular medication, and they sent me a link that had they did a cut and paste from this one site from a paper, and they didn't realize that that was actually the author's conclusion and not the results of a meta-analysis. So, and it was not a correct conclusion. And intelligent people can disagree. I mean, I think especially with us having all of the things that have been going on with COVID lately, I think that we can all say with a great deal of confidence that yes, intelligent people can disagree, and it's okay to disagree. So just to kind of keep those things in mind. So what we're really talking about these days is what's called evidence-based medicine. And there are some other terms that are sometimes used with this, but this has kind of become accepted. It began in the 90s. McMaster University in Canada was one of the first to really kind of sit down and say, let's build a framework for evidence-based medicine. And before that, most medicine was either some evidence, but a lot of I feel this way, or it's always been done this way. That, for example, is why when I was in EMS, we put all car accident people on backboards and left them strapped down, because somebody said that would be a good idea, but nobody ever tested it. So that's what we're trying to get away from, is, the gut feeling sort of stuff, and get to where, yes, we have data to say that this is what is appropriate. So you can see Dr. Sackett and Dr. Guyette were the ones that initially started doing the group work with this. And this is, quote, "The conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients." That was their definition. That was what they wanted to get towards. And we're still working to get towards that. So it's going to blend clinical experience and judgment, systematic analysis and critical appraisal, and very important, of the appropriate published literature. And we're out to remove intuition, anecdote, and supposition. And this is new skills. So, I don't expect anybody to just instantly pick this up and go, oh yeah, I can read this article and here's the problems and here's good points. It takes some practice to do. And I'm not good at it yet either. So, critical appraisal exercise. And this is when you start looking at these papers, there are several places that you can actually download a form, essentially, to be able to say, this is what I need to look at on this. You may have heard Chris and I talking about Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine. I have actually talked to Bat Doctor, as he likes to call himself, and I've talked to him by phone a couple of times, and very, very nice people. He was like, I actually wanted to start up a SGym for EMS. And he was like, okay, well, I'll send you all, a list of all the equipment that I use, but I'm going to send you this format so that, this is how we look at the articles and answer these questions. So, this community is very willing to share what they have. They're not out to make any money off of it. They're not charging for it. So, if somebody has an interest in doing something like that, get you some mentors. And most of these folks are very willing to mentor others. So you need to convert the information into answerable questions, track down, and they talk about with efficiency the best evidence. And so what we're talking about is being able to search, know how to put together a quality search to be able to find the articles that are appropriate to the question that you have. And then look at it to see, is it close to the truth and is it really applicable? There's a lot of studies out there that they're not applicable because the testing that they're using are things that are for, research only. They're not widely available. It may be medications that are not available. So, that's an important question to ask. And then you have to take that appraisal and with clinical expertise, apply the results to your practice. And then do a look back at yourself and be sure that you're applying it appropriately and how is it working for you? So there's nothing that says that you in EMS should not say, you know what, we took this thing from one of these other, studies, meta-analysis, whatever you want to call it, whatever the study was, and we've applied that to our service, our practice, and here's what we came up with. Collect the data. It's doable. These are things that frankly I think EMS should be doing. And this is where it came from, believe it or not, seminars in perinatology. So, and this is Dr. Sackett's. And obviously it's been a while since he did that, 1997. So let's see. No. So Benjamin, that's a good question. If you collect the data in a systematic manner, that's not anecdotal. That anecdotal is where you basically say, I had this patient that had a fall and he hit his head and patient broke his neck and, and he had no symptoms and, where it's just your experience, but not systematically collected and as much as possible, all the variables that you can controlled for. So I understand, and that's actually a good point, but just understand that what I'm talking about is you take this information, you begin to apply it to your own practice. And I'll give you a great example, TXA. So we're in the process of getting TXA and setting up the protocols. Well, one reference that was given to me said that we should be giving 2 grams of it as a slow push over 10 minutes and just doing that rather than what is currently the standard, which is 1 gram as a slow push and then another gram over 8 hours. And there was only one reference for that. And so that was actually based off a single study that was done in the military overseas. So, you're extrapolating a lot of information, and in a sense, that is somewhat anecdotal. But if we're going to do that, then we would want to start collecting data on our outcomes to be able to say, in our experience, this is the data that we collected. These are the patients. This is the information about the patients. And this is what the final outcomes were. So, and then think somehow we got ahead there. So then you have to we talked about point 3. So next would be integrate the appraisal into your practice and apply it. So, and then evaluate your own performance. So the next thing is journals. There are so many journals anymore, and some of them are good. Some of the new ones are good. Some of them not so much. But just keep in mind that every journal and their editorial staff generally have an emphasis or a perspective that they are trying to address and trying to promote. So it may be, if you're talking about pre-hospital emergency care, which is a journal for NAEMT and for the National Association of EMS Physicians, their focus is on pre-hospital care. Whereas if you're talking about New England Journal of Medicine, they're generally talking about internal medicine, and it's very highbrow academic sort of stuff. So, just understand that they have a particular emphasis that they want to push, and that can be good and bad. And they may have good high quality articles, and some, even the New England Journal sometimes has some that are not good quality articles. And then this impact factor, I hadn't heard of this before, but so if they have an IF of 5, then that means that the average citable paper was cited 5 times in the 2 years after it was published. The higher that number, supposedly, the more credible that is. I'm not really sure that I agree with that. And I found certainly plenty of other references that said the IF is not the end all. But it is one of those things that if you do start talking to people, you may hear somebody talking about that, the New England Journal has an IF of 10 or something to that effect. So it does give some evidence of this is a higher quality, but I'm not sure that I'd put a lot of stock in it myself. So this is an example to show you how much information is out there. This was as of 2010. And so we have a new cardiologist who has said, I want to read everything that has been published about echocardiography. Relatively new sort of thing. Turns out that in 2010, there were 156,661 articles pertaining to echocardiography. So let's say that he reads 5 papers per hour, 8 hours per day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year. Yeah, we're going to give him a little bit of time off. It's going to take 11 years to read everything that has already been published. And then during that 11 years, there should be on average 82,000 new papers that will be published. So now he's got another 8 years of reading. Keep in mind, that's full time. That's 8 hours a day that he's just reading. And so just gives you an idea of the explosion of information that's out there. And that doesn't mean that all of those articles are good. So that's what we're trying to get you to have some semblance to be able, or a frame of reference to be able to decide this is good, this is not good. So the other thing that they noticed is that over these years, there has been an increasing rate of retraction. So in other words, I'm trying to think of one that I know of off the top of my head, but an article gets written and it gets published, and then for whatever reason, there's numerous reasons, the journal may say, hold on, we're retracting that article, and they will publish a notice saying that they are retracting that. They take it off of their website. Obviously, if you got it in print, you're going to always have it, but they are pulling back on papers more and more. And that's really kind of troubling, in my opinion. While we're here, let's stop and see if anybody has any questions or comments. You can do the chat, you can unmute your mic. I'm easy going about that.
Hey, Don, this is Yasenko. How are you this evening?
Yeah, good.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. Good stuff so far.
Sure.
So question I have is, so when we sift through some of these journals and articles, obviously, we have to have a kind of cohesive and coherent sniff test, if you will, be applied against these in order to formulate certain decisions. Do you have any recommendations or as
That's coming up.
how to do? Oh, okay. I'm not gonna take away the. Yeah, and then my second question was gonna be just overall, kind of like we all have a tendency to have a bias towards certain sources, right? And then to at times, however, they could overlap or one could trump the findings of another. That's kind of something I'm.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what I would say is, first off, you kind of bring up the papers getting published that cover the same sort of thing. And really the gold standard for science, all branches of science, is reproducibility. So we actually, let's say that you've decided that, I'm coming up with this procedure that will make it obsolete to have to do needle thoracostomies for people with tension pneumothorax. And you develop the procedure and you publish it and you trial it and everything. You want to have other people do trials asking the same question. You want to see, is it real that I got the results that I got, or was it blind luck? Was it just, a fluke that those things happened? And so reproducibility is a big factor. Now, the problem is it's expensive. Most trials, especially when you're talking about medications and stuff, they're expensive. And so who's going to end up paying for that is always the first question. And so, who has a horse in the race, so to speak, is one big question all the time. Who's going to be profiting from the findings of this paper? And could they perhaps have an idea that they want the outcome to be a certain way? And I'll tell you a real story about that in a little bit. So excellent question, though, really. So what would you consider a reputable journal for EMS versus one which is kind of shoddy? Well, in the medical arena, we have a term for the ones that you're kind of referencing at the end there, which is the throwaways. In other words, I get this journal in the mail. I never subscribe to it. They don't charge me anything for it. It just comes in the mail. And, every now and then they have some interesting articles that I might read. But for the most part, I'm not really that impressed with them. So, and people are probably going to get a little bit upset, but I have to say that Jim's is probably one of those that I would consider to be a little bit on the shoddy side. And the reason for that is that it is a trade journal. It is not necessarily a professional journal. They're not doing peer review. That's a very important thing. The one that I would say for EMS is the gold standard would be pre-hospital emergency care. And that started out just for National Association of EMS Physicians, NAEMSP. But once again, there's no reason that any of you guys should not be able to do a research project and write a paper that would be publishable in that journal. And it is peer reviewed. Let's see. Yeah, keep an eye out for the one that may have a hidden interest. That's exactly it. And that's part of the process of looking through the article and actually reading it. Jim's, when I started in EMS, was actually, I thought that it was a useful journal, but they never had peer-reviewed stuff. They never had original research. It was generally some guy that was summarizing an article or something, or talking about, this is how we do it at my place. Um, so, you know, I like Jim's. It's easy to read. It's not something that's cluttered with a bunch of data tables and stuff, but you should be willing to say, okay, you know what? That article in Jim's makes us sound really good. Let me go to their references, because they do put references in there. Let me go to their references and actually read those papers. That's what you really need to do. But excellent questions. So we now have this thing that is just exploding right now, and it really took off when the internet started to explode, and that's this open access journals. They're generally free full text access, and they actually ask the authors to pay for the publishing. So you want to get published, that's fine, we'll take your paper, but you're going to have to pay for it. And so, there are some that are predatory, and so, there are some that are good quality. But once again, you kind of got to know. And there's a link there for a blacklist of those journals that are a little less than reputable. Um, and so, I would tell you, PubMed and PubMed Central are really good sources. PubMed Central, all of those articles there are free. So if you find something on PubMed Central, you can get the full text and it's not going to cost you anything. So that's a really good source. PubMed and PubMed Central are from the National Library of Medicine. So it's part of NIH. You're paying for it in your taxes. So I would definitely recommend using those as your sources to do searches, because you're going to come up with better quality journals. They do have the open access journals on there as well, but those tend to fall down in their search order. So when you get the results, the things that are more reputable tend to be at the top of that search. So let's talk a little bit about peer review. Peer review is a very important process. You need to understand that peer review is a process where if I write a paper and I submit it to a journal, and the editors say, yeah, I think that we can probably work with you on this, they will then take that and send that to at least one, if not two or three peer reviewers. You don't know who they are, and you're not going to find out. And they will look over your paper and they will pick it apart piece by piece, and they will send you back things saying you need to rewrite this section in this manner. You need to collect more data in this area, those sort of things. And understand that yes, it is a very tough process, and it seems rather harsh, but they are trying to protect the journal, and they're trying to give you the best chance to make your article one that is high quality. So it's voluntary. These people that are doing this, they are not paid to do it. They are doing this because they want to help develop medicine and medical literature. Sadly, there is no standard format for how they do this. And that's really a weakness of this particular system. And the editors pick the reviewers that are going to receive the papers. Now, they know who they are, and that can also be used to help to push the agenda of the editorial staff and the journal at large. Currently, nobody trains reviewers. Once again, these are folks that are doing this because they want to give back. And sadly, there's nobody that has set up training for reviewers. As a result of all of this, they talk about a type 1 and a type 2 error. And so if you have a good paper that because of the peer review process gets rejected, that's called a type 2 error. But at the same time, you may have some poor quality papers that get accepted and get published, and that's known as a type 1 error. And for many of the open access journals, there is no peer review. And we'll have a graphic story about that in a second. So this is a doctor that he submitted 8 manuscripts to some of these open access journals that had solicited him to submit manuscripts. And 4 of the papers were written by his 13-year-old daughter, and 4 of them were written by her 15-year-old friend. He did not change anything about them, just sent them to the journals. 9 of the 10 articles, or 9 of the 10 journals responded, with 8 of them accepting them for publication. 6 of them with no revisions. A 13-year-old and a 15-year-old wrote these. And the one journal that rejected it, it was because it was too short. So, that should tell you a little bit about some of these predatory practices. And once again, no peer review. If these have been sent to a peer reviewer, you know that they're probably going to look at this and go, who wrote this? So that's the ugly side of it. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of articles. Does anybody have a question about peer review before we get into this? So peer review is a good thing. It's helpful. These people are doing this voluntarily, and it's a hard job to do, but they really don't get any training and no real backup for it. So, keep those things in mind. So let's talk about the articles themselves, because really in medicine in general, most of them follow this particular format of introduction, methods and materials, results, and discussion, or EMRAD, with the A supposed to be a lowercase a that's in there. Can't do that with this format on this PowerPoint, so I apologize for that. So the introduction. First off, why did they do the study? That's really the big thing. And then they really should always tell you what the question is that they were trying to answer with this paper. If they don't tell you that clearly, that's a red flag. It might not be a good article. Obviously, that's only one point in this, but it's early on. If they failed to tell you what they were looking for, then you really need to kind of go, well, this might not be a good one. Materials and methods. Now, this is said to be the most important section because it's going to tell you things like how the study population was selected, what were the inclusion and exclusion criteria, what exactly were the interventions that they were doing, or what data were they trying to collect. And it's very important because you can get some things that you can pick up, such as selection bias. There's a whole list of biases that you need to kind of look for when you're looking into these things. You want to be sure that it's a true representative cross-section of the people that this is likely to affect. And unfortunately, most of the time it tends to be skipped over. And some journals will actually put that into a smaller font. And the reference that I use for this, that it's almost like they're going, nothing to see here, move along. So the results. So this is where you're going to have these big tables. Sometimes they're, all the way across the entire page that has multiple columns of all the data that was collected. And then you'll also see data that is then interpreted through the statistical analysis. And they basically, this is where they're telling you, exactly what they found. And they should tell you everything. Now, if they don't give you data that is addressing that research question from the introduction, again, it's a red flag. So just keep those in mind. Then the next part, the discussion. Now, this is where a lot of people, if they read more than the abstract, they'll actually read. And it should be a straightforward description of what was found and a top take-home message. I know the Journal of the American Medical Association has now started putting little boxes, and actually Annals of Emergency Medicine does the same thing. They put little boxes that will tell you, this is what they were actually looking for. This is the implications of the study. This is the actual take-home message, and break it down into bullet points. Keep in mind, though, that's somebody else's opinion of it. That's not what you may get out of the article. So once again, you need to be willing to read the article in its entirety with an open mind and not use somebody else's opinion to say, yeah, okay, yeah, I can see where they came up with that. You may not come up with the same ideas. They should also describe future research. We talked about reproducibility being the gold standard. This is where they should say, okay, you know what, we had some limitations. Here were the problems that we had. And if we were doing the study again, this is what we would do differently. They should do that. It's not saying that you failed. In fact, that's actually a point of something that should be applauded, that somebody is willing to look at their own paper skeptically and say, I didn't do something right, and be willing to say, this is what the next research team should try to do. So the limitations is one of the things that I've always tried to look at when I do read the papers, is I want to sit there and see what their limitations were. And Amanda, excellent point. Yes, that is where they should try to say, okay, we came up with this next sort of thing, and suggest, a different take on the same project, perhaps, or a different community to try to focus on. But excellent question. And once again, if they don't describe the limitations, and every paper has some limitations, that should be a really big red flag that they're trying to hide something. So now, obviously, I stole this from somewhere else, but basically these are some samples of clinical questions based on different things, such as, a therapeutic question, a screening test, prognosis, causation. That one right there is one that is always a big question, no matter what. Actually, Chris, there are some papers that do come out that they say, we really didn't find the answers that we thought that we were going to find, and we can't really tell you, what we were looking for wasn't there. So those things do happen, and probably quite a bit. Well, idiopathic is actually a clinical term, and that just refers to not being able to diagnose it for any number of reasons. I always tell folks, it means the idiot me can't figure out the pathology or what's going on. But it's one of those things that really, it's not a bad term to use, but it kind of sounds like it is. But yeah, I agree. So let's talk about some different designs. Yeah, I agree, Chris. I think that really what we mean most of the time when we say idiopathic is we should say, here are a list of the things that we know are not causing this, whatever it is. And so there are some things that are subclinical, and so they are not to the point where they are discoverable at that point in time. And some of those things may not be for years, and it's going to take better testing, different testing, uh, different way of imagining something to be able to find those idiopathic things. I mean, it hasn't been that long that we've known about DNA. And so for a long time, the, traits that were passed from one to another, we didn't know why those happened. We had some thoughts about it, but nobody could prove it. And now we know the entire human genome. So, and that's just been since the 60s. So, you know, the information is exploding, and some of the things, such as idiopathic apnea for certain patients, those may end up having actual diagnosis. So let's see, let's go back here. Ethical implications. Those are things that when you're doing a study have to actually be asked before you even start the study. And there are things called investigational review boards and ethics committees that look at those proposals for projects and experiments before they're even begun, so that ethical questions are addressed beforehand. For pre-hospital stuff, consent. Consent is always a difficult thing for us in pre-hospital medicine to get, because some things, yeah, you can ask a patient, but let's say it's a cardiac arrest study. You can't ask their permission to take part in the study or not when they're in cardiac arrest. And so, there are methods to say that you have addressed the community and to be able to obtain those things. And that's where the ethics parts come in. Certainly, there are some things that you just can't study because it's not ethical to study. Withholding antibiotics for sepsis, you can't do that. So, but I understand what you're talking about, Amanda. So the articles can omit the information that led them to do the research paper if the paper goes in another direction. I think what you're asking is, can you withhold some of the data? And I guess there's really two ways to ask that question. Has it happened, and is it ethical? And the answer is, yeah, it certainly has happened. And is it ethical? I don't think so. But I'll come back to that again in just a second. Actually, as far as about military research, there is a lot of money to be made in that, not by the officers, not by the soldiers, but by the companies. And they are not trying to sell to the military per se. They are, but really they want to get every person that's in law enforcement and every firefighter and every paramedic carrying their tourniquet, for instance. So, that to say that they're not trying to sell anything, they are. And as far as bias goes, well, the bias, there's so many different ways to view bias. A pool of 20-something-year-old healthy males, right there, you're not covering an age spectrum adequately. and you're selecting only men. So, there's a lot of things there that, there are some things that they can do in the military that we can't really do ethically in the civilian world. Um, and so, but at the same time, they still have to go through the same investigational review boards and things like that. So, but I would urge you to think, yeah, actually, somebody's trying to sell something when they're doing these projects with the military. Tell you what, let me stop for just a second. Let's address the thing about the data. I'm sure that you all know about Tamiflu and have at least heard of it. And there was a huge push to market that to the general public. When you get the flu, go and tell your doctor that you want Tamiflu. And that particular drug, when they did the studies, they cherry picked the data. They did not include a lot of things. They said that it would prevent people from contracting the flu if they didn't have it. They said that it would keep people from having to go into the hospital. It would prevent them from getting pneumonia. It would prevent people from dying. And the truth of the matter, when all of the data was finally released, was it did absolutely none of the things that they said. It doesn't do any of that. They said that it was going to cut 2 days off of your flu symptoms. It actually is 17 hours on average when all of the data that they collected is presented. It ended up that the British Medical Journal and the Cochrane Consortium sued the maker of the drug to have all of that data released. And then they did a meta-analysis over all the data and all the studies, and that was what they came up with. So, it's one of those where, unfortunately, those things happen. And obviously, the drug company had put a lot of money into Tamiflu, and their goal is to get their money back and make more. So they have a huge incentive to pressure the researchers to not release everything. They own that data. It's theirs. And they will tell you that without their permission, you can't publish it. So that's just one example. So it's disclosure statements. Well, first off, having recruited people for a few studies, the disclosures are some things where you basically are saying, this is what this drug is, this is what it does, and this is the known side effects. These are some other potential side effects, and basically trying to be sure that it's an informed consent.
I was actually talking about like author disclosure statements.
Okay. Yeah. So disclosing their conflicts and things like that. Is that what you mean?
Yes, sir. Sorry, hit the wrong button.
Okay. Okay. So, once again, that's kind of voluntary. There's no repository where you can go and search, my name and see, what drug companies may have given me money for certain things. So you're trusting that they are being honest about it. But the truth of the matter is that they generally are going to be honest about it, but they don't have to be. As far as, once again, if the drug company is sponsoring the research, technically they own all of that data, and they have non-disclosure agreements that they make the researchers sign, saying that they will only release it with the company's approval. And those are some of the dark side of all this. Well, the IRBs, and we were also part of the um, Resuscitation Outcome Consortium, the ROC. And that's actually a national organization. And so it gets to be a very, very cumbersome structure because you have an IRB that is over the entire project. And then each hospital or EMS or whoever will also have their own IRB. And everybody at the IRB, their job is to make sure that everything is done in a safe and consistent manner and with proper approvals in place. And that is actually government mandated. Um, so, yeah, some things you wonder how they got past an IRB to be studied. IRBs are not something that's been around a long, long time. So they weren't always there before. Think about the Tuskegee experiment where they were giving black men syphilis. Yeah, you can't do that. Um, yeah, I like the figures don't lie, but liars can figure. Um, and yes, this is why we all need to be skeptical of these things. We need to look at everything with a skeptical eye. So let's talk a little bit about some of the study designs because there are several different ways of doing studies. Most of us probably are familiar with the RCTs, randomized controlled trials, also known as double-blind crossover trials. So you have basically the patient sign saying, yes, I'll participate, and they agree that they will not know if they're getting the study medication or not. Um, so then you also have to have a control group as well as an intervention group, and sometimes multiple intervention groups. But those are the ones where you're looking to see, is this an appropriate treatment, those sort of things. Um, Prognosis studies says the RCTs may be unethical. Yeah, if you're saying that in your control group, you're not going to give them anything for their suffering or for their disease, that's probably unethical and that would not get through an IRB. Cohort study is basically saying, for example, people with lung cancer, you want to take a group of people that have that certain type of cancer and you follow them and see what happens based on whatever the interventions are, and that gives you the prognosis for that particular disease and treatment. A diagnosis is cross-sectional sort of thing, and with that, take for instance, smoking and lung cancer. They did a cross-section analysis to be able to say that smokers were the ones that were getting this, and virtually everybody that developed a lung cancer were smokers, and that was because they did a cross-section analysis of all smokers and then correlated the two things back together. Now, causation, you have to have the cohort or the case controls. Once again, go back to the smoking and lung cancer sort of things. Those were case controls as well. And in those cases, they had the diagnosis. Now let's look and see what the common factors are in there. And the other thing that you'll hear over and over and over is correlation is not causation. And it's a fine line sometimes between those. So here are all the different types of or study designs and basically what they mean. So you have the case reports. These are the things that most people want to try to get published. I had something unusual happen, and let me tell you about it. And here's what I did to save a life or whatever. Case series or small groups that have the same thing, and it's really useful to say, okay, in idiopathic apnea, we've looked at 10 of these patients that have this, and here are the common factors that we found. and we believe that perhaps this is a cause of this, and make suggestions for further study. And then you can read through the rest of those. We've talked about the RCT and some of these others. The one that I really kind of want you to look at are the bottom two: systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And they really kind of are meshed together, because in a systematic review, you're going to go to PubMed or PubMed Central, and you're going to put in search terms so that you get as many papers covering that particular clinical question that you have. What is the best way to treat somebody that has otitis media, for example? And so you go and you pull all the papers that pertain to that, and then you review all of those. Then you look to see their quality, their selections, their selection bias, their errors, all those sort of things. And then the next part, and once again, it kind of meshes together, is the meta-analysis. So if you find that there have been 4 studies where they are using warm saline for people that have hypothermic cardiac arrest versus warm lactated ringers. And so, but the studies are small because they don't happen very often. And so if you get more than a couple of studies and you combine the data that is common in those, then it makes for a more powerful study overall. And that's what a meta-analysis is you look at data from more than a couple of studies, and you try to answer a question that you couldn't answer otherwise. So there's pitfalls with all of this. First off, there are numerous forms of bias, selection bias. There is outcome bias, where you're expecting a certain outcome, and so when that's what you're looking for, that's what you tend to find. There can be circular reasoning. Not describing the limitations is considered a methodological pitfall. And then here's just all the potential biases that are in medical research. So, you can see there's so many different ways to have some sort of a bias that can cause your data to be tainted. Yeah, the Six Sigma, and I mean, there's many others that do those sort of things, where they're trying to get reproducibility of results all the time, and day in, day out as well. So here are some of the rhetorical pitfalls. So trying to say that something is causation rather than just simply an association. So for example, early on with dietary advice, they said, it looks like people that eat saturated fats have a higher chance of heart disease. So obviously that is causing heart disease. No, that's an association. That's not causation. And so, now we realize that, hey, even the Heart Association and College of Cardiology is saying saturated fats are not a bad thing for your heart. So that's where they finally got back to, it's not causation. Okay. Trying to generalize things too quickly. So in other words, you may have a finding in a very small study, and the findings only apply to a small subset of the population. You can't generalize that to everyone. Great example, in my opinion, is some of the generalizations that started out with COVID about, you have to, take hydroxychloroquine, for example. We tried to overgeneralize those things very quickly, and you can see that it caused some problems. I like this argumentum ad ignorantium. So that one is, you're basically saying without any real data to back it up, what you believe that the findings are. Straw man is basically you're changing something about an argument to make it so easy to push over. It's like a straw man. So, and there are so many of these sort of things. So, the very end, you're going to have references, and that's a list of the citations that support the article. Now, there's this thing called a chain citation, where the same citation is used over and over in the same article, but they're not really saying what they're saying that it says. So they talk about the telephone game. So if you've ever done that with your kids, and you start out with one thing at the start and something totally different at the end, that's an example of a chain citation. And then sometimes they didn't actually read the reference that they're putting in there. And so they may not realize that just because it says XYZ in the title, that may not be what the actual finding was in the paper. And if they had read the paper, they might have noticed that the author said, no, this really didn't happen. It was what we thought would happen, but it didn't, for example. So, they have to be careful to read the literature as well. So, questions to that point. Here's a list of my references. And you can see there are several of these that are PubMed Central articles, and full text is right there on that link. And then next one, I would encourage you to start looking for FOAM, free open access medicine. And it's actually medical education, but foamy didn't sound right. But these are places where you can get information, you can see meta-analysis, you can see what other people are writing about certain articles and things like that. Life in the Fast Lane was the first one in emergency medicine. It's still there, going strong. It's a very well referenced sort of thing. This is also from their website. Foam is a concept and Foam ED is conversation. There is also Foam critical care and Foam anesthesia, and I believe Foam surgery. And so you don't have to do anything. You can just log into their webpage, or you don't even have to log in. You can just open their webpage and start using their information, and everything is free. I like Rebel EM. It's actually the folks out of UT San Antonio that run Rebel EM, and they do an excellent job. And Chris and I were talking about the Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine, and they and Rebel EM do the same sort of thing. Skeptic's Guide, they have a guest skeptic that comes on during their podcast, and the Kim Milne, the owner of the podcast, will talk to them, and they will have a clinical case, and then they will come up with a clinical question, research question to be answered, and then they will go through an article that is current and cutting edge, and they will pick it apart. They will find as many flaws and things as they can, all the good stuff, and then they will come up with a good analysis of that paper. And it's an excellent thing for you to go and listen to either Skeptic's Guide or Rebel EM, so that you can start learning to see how to read some of these articles, and send them an email. They'll answer you. They will definitely answer you. This one is actually all EMS, and it is a Foam EMS site. It's the only one that I've been able to find so far. It's out of Europe, but I actually kind of like that website. It's pretty good. So it's easy to get into. And you've got the website right there. And then science-based medicine. Now, you may have heard us talking about the tagline for Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine. Be skeptical of everything that you learn, even if you learned it here on the Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine. That Dr. Milne actually ripped that off from the people that started up the science-based medicine. And that was from the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And it actually is a physician and some of his family that started that. And let's see, yeah. So they started Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and when they were kids, they actually started this thing called the New England Skeptical Society, and they debunk stuff. They have a lot of science stuff in there, as well as things like faith healers and things like that. But their tagline was "Be skeptical of everything." So there's some good references there. Dr. Stephen Novella, Novella, is the one that started the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. He is a neurologist at Yale. And if you get a chance to hear him lecture, I think he's an excellent lecturer. I actually own a couple of his lecture series from Audible. And also his book called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which is how to be skeptical. And you really need to probably read it rather than listen to it, because it really gets heavy at some areas, and it's difficult to kind of keep it all together. But I definitely recommend, especially if you're new to this sort of thing, look at Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine, because Ken breaks everything down very nicely. It's very entertaining as well. So just, go to their webpage, Rebel EM, Life in the Fast Lane. Go to those web pages and, pick an area, and, whatever kind of is interesting to you, and open it up and take a look at what you see there. So I see St. Fisher Church of Evidence-Based Medicine. I can't say that I've heard of that one. I'm going to have to look at that. So any other questions? You can unmute your microphone and ask.
I've got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not really sure if this is something you can answer right now, but can you kind of talk a little bit about how to integrate what you find into the real world? I get super frustrated as I look at studies and you learn all this information and you're like, wow, that's really cool. Learn something new, things, now I understand things more clearly, or they didn't work the way we thought they did. Kind of makes you all excited to go out and sort of change the world. And then nobody wants to hear about it. They don't want to introduce anything new. They don't even want to hear it. How do you kind of start that process of having other people think critically and either change what they're doing or sort of assess what they're doing critically? Because I find that that's really hard.
Well, I guess the question that I would have is, are you talking about it within EMS or just the world in general?
Mostly in EMS, or your certain agency, or your your group that you're working with.
Okay, so I'll just tell you that first off, part of it is having a medical director that's willing to sit down and talk with you about the stuff. We recently changed our FTO structure at Life Care in Parker County, and we have some field training officers that are very gung-ho about trying to get some critical care protocols and stuff. And they felt like they needed to have a formal presentation to me in order to do that. And I'm like, no, we need that. Please, let's do this. At the same time, they came to me with the question about using TXA in a manner that was cited in one article and then was discussed at the Special Operations Medical Association meeting, and they made a recommendation to change the dosing at the TCCC level, but it hadn't been implemented. And they were very gung ho to start treating it this way. And yeah, I asked him to please send me all the references. And when I looked at it, I'm like, okay, first off, I see where you got this and I understand it, but that is not ready for prime time yet. And I, in the process, talk with the trauma surgeons that I work with and try to get their opinion about the stuff as well, because obviously we interact with several folks. You know, we interact with surgeons, we interact with the hospital, with the nursing staff. And so we do have to have some buy-in for those sort of things beforehand. But at the same time, I think anytime that you can bring literature to your medical director and say, you know, I didn't know if you had seen this. What are your thoughts on this? Can we sit down and talk about it? I'll let you have this, and let's set a meeting in a week or so, and let's sit down and talk about this and come at it from the perspective of, you know, I am brand new with this. I want you to please teach me, because they may see something in an article or something that, you know, you didn't see that and you didn't take that into account. You know, I'm trying to think of another good example, but you know, I will very frequently ask, okay, what is this going to change? And you know, those are some of the questions that you should think about ahead of time, and that is ultrasound, for instance. Me doing a fast exam in the field, if I'm a paramedic, what is that going to change? They're still going to go to the trauma center. They're still going to get the same evaluation by the trauma team when they get there. And are they going to accept my ultrasound reading? Are they going to insist that they have their own first? So those are some of the things that you need to think about. And I will tell you that as a medical director, my opinion on that one issue is evolving. And it's evolving because of price, and some of the technology has changed so much. And so, you know, by all means, I want my people to bring me literature and say, look, I've already researched this and this is what I've found. Here's the citation, you know, read it, see what you think. And yeah, I think that those are very, very valid ways to do that. So I'm reading the comments here. So Benjamin, I'm not familiar with the Rolo program. Can you unmute your mic and just, because once again, I learned when you guys ask questions. So I don't know what the Rolo program is.
He may not be able to unmute because I think for him it's somewhere around 3 a.m.
Okay. Let me see if I can look it up right quick. Okay, so yeah, so blood transfusion from one person to another. You know, that was actually another one of the things that our crews were wanting to talk to me about, was low titer blood, whole blood. And you know, while I love the idea, at the same time, there's only like, I think the air medical units and one ground unit in our region is even doing this. And so, you know, I I've already kind of contacted a friend of mine that is a transfusion pathologist about, okay, we may need some help with this if we get this far, setting up how to get it from the blood bank and how to, how we have to handle it and what are the quality things. So, I like the idea. My concern with the whole blood is always, is it going to affect the blood supply? And how often are we going to do this? Is it going to be something where when, you do it maybe once every 2 years as an individual paramedic? How are we going to miss something? So, but yeah, very, very interesting. You guys are having some excellent comments and excellent questions tonight. And I really do appreciate that. And I firmly agree with Dr. Strength that, I learn so much when you ask questions. Does anybody have anything else? We're about 15 minutes over. Seems like I'm always at least 15 minutes over, if not more.
We ran 30 minutes over last night, but there were questions and everything else, and nobody really minded. So,
okay. Well, and I hope that you'll look at some of the references that I've given you and be able to, download some of the forms and some of the, and even if you just take a look at Rebel EM or Skeptic's Guide, and you see exactly their forms and stuff right there. I mean, they filled them out and it looks more like a paragraph, but if you just look at their questions, you get all the same questions that you need to be asking every time that you read a paper. Obviously, many times you're going to sit there with that form and ask those questions as you go, but as you do this more and more, you get to where you'll have those things just pop out. So, all right. Well, I appreciate everyone's attention. You guys have once again asked some really good questions, and I appreciate that. And everyone participated. So I'll get that along to Jane, and we'll get it all credited appropriately. But I do appreciate everyone's participation. So go get some rest and have a good night.
have a good evening, sir.
Thank you.